The morning sun cast long shadows across the university campus as Anthony walked with purpose toward his first class. At 35, he stood out among the younger students rushing past him. His military haircut was growing out, but his posture, straight-backed and alert, gave away his background as surely as the one backpack that had accompanied him through 2 tours in Afghanistan. After 15 years serving his country, Anthony had finally returned to complete the education that had been put on hold when he enlisted. His hands tightened around the strap of his backpack as he checked the campus map one more time. Room 237. American History with Professor Whitman. "You can navigate war zones," he muttered to himself with a nervous smile. "You can figure out a college campus." But the truth was, Anthony felt more out of place here than he ever had overseas. There, he knew his purpose and role. Here, surrounded by students fresh out of high school, he questioned if he'd made the right choice coming back to school. The hallway was nearly empty when he found the classroom. He was 20 minutes early. Old habits die hard. In the military, being early meant being on time, and being on time meant being late. Anthony chose a seat in the middle row, not wanting to appear too eager in the front or too disengaged in the back. As he arranged his new notebook and pens, memories of his high school days came flooding back. He'd been a decent student back then, but never exceptional. Would things be different now? He hoped the discipline and focus he'd gained in the army would serve him well. Students began trickling in, most of them barely glancing at Anthony before finding seats beside friends or pulling out phones. A young woman with colorful braids took the seat next to him, offering a quick smile. "First day?" she asked, noticing his perfectly organized desk. "That obvious, huh?" Anthony laughed softly. "Little bit. I'm Tanya." "Anthony, nice to meet you." "You don't look like a freshman," she observed without judgment. "I'm not. Army vet. Finally using my GI Bill to finish what I started a long time ago." Tanya's eyes widened with interest. "That's cool. My uncle served too. Different path, but he said it was the best decision he ever made." Before Anthony could respond, the classroom door opened with a bang. A tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun strode in, their heels clicking sharply against the floor. The casual chatter in the room immediately died down. "Professor Whitman, I presume," Anthony whispered. Tanya nodded silently. The professor surveyed the room with piercing eyes, pausing briefly when she spotted Anthony. Something in her expression changed, so quickly he almost missed it, before she continued her assessment of the class. "Welcome to American History 201, she began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "If you're looking for an easy credit or a class where participation is optional, I suggest you leave now." No one moved. "Good. Now, I expect excellence in this classroom, nothing less." She began distributing the syllabus, continuing to speak as she moved between rows. "This course will challenge your preconceptions about American history. Some of you may find your cherished beliefs questioned. That is the point of higher education." When she reached Anthony, she placed the syllabus on his desk with a bit more force than necessary. Their eyes met briefly, and Anthony felt an unexpected chill. As Professor Whitman returned to the front of the room, Anthony flipped through the extensive reading list and assignment schedule. It would be challenging, especially while juggling his part-time job at the Veterans Center, but he was no stranger to hard work. "I expect your first paper on my desk by next Monday," Professor Whitman was saying. 2,000 words on how personal background influences historical interpretation. Anthony jotted down notes, a small smile playing on his lips. He had more personal background than most when it came to history. He'd lived through parts of it that most of his classmates had only read about in textbooks or seen on the news. As the class ended, Anthony felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This new mission would test him in ways different from what he'd faced before, but he was ready for the challenge. What he didn't know was that Professor Whitman would soon become his most unexpected adversary, and that the skills he'd learned in combat would be tested in ways he never imagined. 2 weeks into the semester, Anthony had settled into a rhythm. Wake up at 5 a.m., go for a run, shower, study for an hour, then head to campus. His military discipline served him well as he tackled assignments with the same focus he once applied to missions abroad. American history with Professor Whitman remained challenging, not just because of the workload, but because of the tension that filled the room whenever he spoke. He'd noticed how she seemed to call on everyone but him, even when his hand was the only one raised. Today's topic was foreign military interventions during the Cold War. As Professor Whitman lectured about misguided military actions, Anthony found himself mentally noting the oversimplifications in her argument. He had friends who'd served in these later conflicts, and their experiences painted a more complex picture than what she was presenting. "Any questions before we move on?" Professor Whitman asked, her gaze sweeping past Anthony. He raised his hand anyway. After an uncomfortable pause, she finally acknowledged him with a tight smile. "Yes, Mr. Rivers?" "I wanted to add some context to the discussion about the humanitarian aspects of these interventions," Anthony said carefully. "During my time overseas, I saw firsthand how—" "Mr. Rivers," Professor Whitman cut in, her voice sharp, "while I appreciate your personal anecdotes, this is an academic setting where we rely on scholarly sources, not stories from soldiers who were simply following orders without understanding the bigger picture." The classroom went dead silent. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "With all due respect, Professor," Anthony continued, keeping his voice steady despite the heat rising in his face, "military personnel are briefed extensively on geopolitical contexts. My point was that the humanitarian efforts, building schools, providing medical care, often go undiscussed in academic texts." Professor Whitman's lips thinned into a hard line. "I'm sure that's what they told you to believe. However, those so-called humanitarian efforts were primarily PR campaigns designed to mask the true nature of American imperialism." Anthony felt eyes on him from all directions. Tanya, sitting beside him again, subtly shook her head as if warning him not to push it further. "Now, as I was saying before the interruption," Professor Whitman continued, turning back to her slides. For the rest of the class, Anthony sat still, taking notes mechanically while processing what had just happened. He wasn't naive. He'd faced discrimination before, but he hadn't expected it in this setting, from someone who presumably valued critical thinking and diverse perspectives. When class ended, several students glanced at him sympathetically as they filed out. Tanya lingered. "That was rough," she whispered. "She had no right to shut you down like that." Anthony shrugged, packing his notebook away. "Not the first time someone's made assumptions about me." "Still, you should report her." "For what?" "Saying what plenty of people think." He shook his head. "I didn't come here to start fights." As they walked out, Professor Whitman called out, "Mr. Rivers, a moment please." Tanya gave his arm a squeeze before leaving him alone with the professor. "I want to make something clear," Professor Whitman said once the room was empty. "Your military background doesn't give you special authority in my classroom. Many students find it intimidating when you speak about your combat experiences." Anthony blinked in surprise. "I've never mentioned combat in class. I was talking about community relations work." "The point stands," she said dismissively. "This is a place of academic discourse, not war stories. Perhaps the community college across town would be a better fit for someone with your background." The implication hung in the air between them. Was she referring to his military service, his race, his age, or all three? Anthony couldn't be sure, but the message was clear. She didn't think he belonged. "Thank you for your concern, Professor," he said evenly, years of military discipline keeping his voice calm. "But I earned my place here just like everyone else. I'll see you Thursday." As he walked away, Anthony felt a familiar determination settling in his chest. He'd faced enemy fire with less fear than he felt confronting this woman's prejudice. But he hadn't survived 2 tours by backing down from challenges, and he wouldn't start now. This was a different kind of battlefield, one that would require new tactics and even greater patience. But if there was one thing his military career had taught him, it was how to fight smart, not just hard. Over the next 3 weeks, Anthony noticed a pattern emerging in Professor Whitman's class. Whenever he raised his hand, she would either ignore him completely or call on him last, after exhausting all other options. When she did acknowledge him, she would interrupt his points midway, something she rarely did with other students. After receiving a C on his first paper, despite spending more time on it than any other assignment, Anthony began to wonder if he was just imagining things. Maybe his work really wasn't up to college standards after 15 years away from school. "Can I see your paper?" Tanya asked after class when she noticed his frown. They had fallen into the habit of grabbing coffee after history class, a bright spot in what was becoming an increasingly tense part of his week. Anthony handed it over, watching as she scanned through Professor Whitman's harsh red comments that filled the margins. Words like simplistic, lacks academic rigor, and unsuitable tone jumped out from the page. Tanya's eyebrows rose higher with each note. "This is ridiculous," she finally said. "My roommate Lee got a B+, and trust me, your paper is way better than hers. Let me show you." The next day, Tanya brought Lee's paper. The difference in grading was obvious. Where Professor Whitman had torn apart Anthony's analysis, she had praised nearly identical points in Lee's work. "This isn't right," Tanya said, her voice low but angry. "You should talk to the department head." Anthony shook his head. "Not yet. I need more evidence." That Thursday, things escalated during a discussion about economic policies of the 1980s. Anthony had worked particularly hard preparing for this topic, having lived through some of the consequences of these policies in his own neighborhood growing up. The data shows that these tax cuts primarily benefited upper-income households, Professor Whitman was saying, while urban communities suffered disproportionately. Anthony raised his hand, and to his surprise, Professor Whitman called on him immediately. "Mr. Rivers, you seem eager to contribute today." "Yes, Professor. I've done some additional research on how these policies affected specific communities. The housing project where I grew up saw funding cuts of nearly 40% during this period, which led to—" "Mr. Rivers," she interrupted sharply, "we're discussing economic theory here, not neighborhood gossip. Perhaps you could stick to the academic sources I assigned rather than personal stories." The dismissal was so blatant that several students exchanged glances. A guy in the front row, Thomas, who rarely spoke, actually turned around to look at Anthony with surprise. "I was referencing the Mitchell study from the reading list," Anthony clarified calmly, though he could feel his heart pounding. "It specifically examines the impact on housing projects in 5 major cities." Professor Whitman's eyes narrowed. "Well, you certainly didn't make that clear. In the future, cite your sources properly when speaking, just as you would in a paper." She quickly called on another student, effectively shutting down Anthony's point. After class, Thomas approached Anthony as he was packing up. "Hey, that was weird what happened. You clearly knew what you were talking about." Anthony shrugged. "Yeah, well." "No, seriously," Thomas insisted. "She does the same thing to Dani over there." He nodded toward a young woman with a hijab who was leaving the classroom. "And to Richard, who's the only openly gay guy in class. It's like she has some kind of list." That evening, Anthony sat in the quiet corner of the library where he usually studied. Instead of working on his next assignment, he opened a fresh document and began to type. He listed every instance he could remember of Professor Whitman's behavior toward him, including exact quotes and dates. Then he added what he'd observed or heard about her treatment of other minority students. Looking at the growing list, a memory surfaced from his military days. His commanding officer teaching them about documenting hostile situations. Don't just react. Record. Build your case methodically. The truth has power, but only if you can prove it. Anthony hadn't planned on fighting this battle when he enrolled in college. He'd hoped to keep his head down, get his degree, and move on. But as he thought about Dani, Richard, and possibly others experiencing the same treatment, something shifted in his perspective. This wasn't just about him anymore. In the army, you never left your people behind. You stood up when others couldn't. Maybe that principle applied here too. As he walked home under the darkening sky, Anthony pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd been given during orientation, but never thought he'd use. Veterans Affairs Office, a voice answered. "Hi," Anthony said. "My name's Anthony Rivers. I'm a student and a veteran, and I think I need some advice about a situation with one of my professors." He didn't know it yet, but that call would be the first step in a chain of events that would change not just his own experience at the university, but potentially the experiences of countless students who would come after him. The Veterans Affairs Office connected Anthony with Mr. Wilson, a student advocate who had been helping veterans navigate university life for over a decade. After hearing Anthony's concerns, he advised patience and continued documentation. Document every interaction, save every email, keep copies of all your graded work, Mr. Wilson told him. If we're going to address this, we need a solid case. Anthony followed this advice, recording each class interaction in a small notebook immediately after leaving the room. Meanwhile, he put extra effort into his coursework, determined not to give Professor Whitman any legitimate reason to criticize him. 2 weeks later, the class began a unit on civil rights movements. Anthony spent hours preparing, knowing this topic would be especially meaningful to him. His grandfather had marched with Dr. King, and those stories had shaped Anthony's own sense of dignity and purpose long before he joined the military. The classroom was unusually full that day. A guest lecturer was scheduled to join Professor Whitman, Dr. Taylor, an older black professor whose work on civil rights history was widely respected. As students settled in, Anthony noticed Professor Whitman looking irritated, checking her watch repeatedly. 5 minutes after class should have started, she addressed the room. It appears Dr. Taylor is running late. We'll begin without him. She launched into a lecture that seemed designed to cover as much material as possible before the guest arrived. When she reached a section about the economic impact of segregation, Anthony raised his hand to add context about his grandfather's experiences as a business owner during that era. Professor Whitman's eyes narrowed, but with the full classroom watching, she called on him. Yes, Mr. Rivers. My grandfather owned a barbershop in Birmingham during this period, Anthony began. The economic statistics you're showing match what he experienced, but there's an additional factor he often mentioned. Mr. Rivers, she cut in, while your family anecdotes are touching, we're discussing documented economic trends here, not personal stories. Before Anthony could respond, the classroom door opened and Dr. Taylor entered, apologizing for his delay. Professor Whitman quickly shifted attention to him, effectively silencing Anthony's contribution once again. As Dr. Taylor took over the lecture, delivering a powerful presentation about the less discussed aspects of the civil rights movement, Anthony noticed Professor Whitman becoming increasingly tense. When the guest opened the floor for questions, student hands shot up across the room, eager to engage with the renowned historian. The discussion was vibrant, with Dr. Taylor encouraging students to challenge assumptions and think critically. When Anthony asked a question connecting historical civil rights strategies to modern movements, Dr. Taylor responded with enthusiasm, expanding on Anthony's points and asking follow-up questions that led to a deeper discussion. That's precisely the kind of connection we need to be making, Dr. Taylor said, nodding appreciatively. What's your name, young man? Anthony Rivers, sir. Well, Mr. Rivers, you've clearly done your homework. That's the kind of analytical thinking we need more of. From the corner of his eye, Anthony could see Professor Whitman's face darkening. When Dr. Taylor finally wrapped up, thanking the class for their engagement, she quickly stepped forward. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Now, before we end, I want to remind everyone that your research papers are due next Monday. Remember, I expect proper academic sources, not opinion pieces or personal experiences disguised as analysis. Her gaze landed directly on Anthony as she spoke. Several students noticed the pointed comment, exchanging uncomfortable glances. After class, as Anthony was packing up, Dr. Taylor approached him. Mr. Rivers, that was an excellent question you asked. Are you a history major? No, sir. Political science with a minor in public policy. I'm hoping to work in Veterans Affairs after graduation. You have a good mind for connecting historical patterns to current issues. That's valuable in policy work. As they talked, Professor Whitman interrupted, her voice overly bright. Dr. Taylor, the department chair was hoping to speak with you before you leave campus. Dr. Taylor nodded, then turned back to Anthony. Keep up the good work, son. We need more thinkers like you in public service. After the guest professor left, Professor Whitman lingered, arranging papers on her desk. When only Anthony remained in the room, she spoke without looking up. Mr. Rivers, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't monopolize guest lecturers with questions clearly designed to show off. Some students found it rather presumptuous, especially given your academic standing in this class. The words hit like a physical blow. Anthony had been holding his tongue for weeks, documenting every slight, every unfair grade. But something about this final comment, coming right after a respected academic had praised his thinking, broke through his careful restraint. "Professor Whitman," he said quietly, "may I ask you a direct question?" She looked up, surprised by his tone. "What exactly is your problem with me?" The question hung in the air between them, simple but powerful. It was the breaking point, the moment that would set in motion everything that followed. Professor Whitman's eyes widened at Anthony's direct question. For a moment, she seemed genuinely taken aback by his boldness. "Excuse me," she finally said, straightening her spine. "I don't have a problem with you, Mr. Rivers. I simply maintain high standards for all my students." Anthony nodded slowly. "I understand having high standards. In the military, standards can mean the difference between life and death, but standards should be applied equally. Are you suggesting I'm treating you unfairly?" Her voice had a dangerous edge. "I'm suggesting," Anthony said carefully, "that you've interrupted me in every class discussion, graded my work more harshly than my classmates with similar answers, and dismissed my contributions even when they're directly from the course materials." Professor Whitman's face flushed. "Perhaps you're not as prepared for university-level work as you believe. Many returning students struggle to adjust. It's nothing to be ashamed of." "I have a 3.8 GPA in my other classes," Anthony replied evenly. "And I've earned it. All I'm asking for is the same fair treatment you give other students." "I think we're done here," she said coldly. "If you have concerns about your grades, there's a formal appeal process. Though I should warn you, such appeals rarely succeed without substantial evidence." As Anthony left the empty classroom, his heart was pounding. He hadn't planned to confront her directly, but something about the moment had pushed him past his carefully maintained patience. Now he wondered if he'd made things worse. That evening, his phone buzzed with a text from Tanya York. "Heard about what happened after class? Bold move. News traveled fast on campus." Anthony sighed and called her instead of texting back. "So everyone knows?" he asked when she answered. "Not everyone, but word's getting around. Thomas was right outside the door and heard most of it. He told a few people." Anthony groaned. "Great." "Actually, it might be," Tanya said. "People are talking about other times they've seen her do this. Not just to you. Danny from our class reached out to me asking for your contact info. She wants to talk." By the end of the week, Anthony had spoken with 5 other students who shared similar experiences with Professor Whitman. Each had stories of dismissive comments, unfair grading, or being silenced in class discussions. All were either minority students, veterans, or both. "What are you going to do?" asked Richard, one of the students who had reached out. They were sitting in the campus coffee shop, away from busy areas where they might be overheard. "I'm not sure yet," Anthony admitted. "Mr. Wilson at Veterans Affairs suggested documenting everything, which I've been doing. But I don't want to just file a complaint that gets buried in administrative paperwork." "We could all file together," suggested Dani, adjusting her hijab. "Strength in numbers, right?" Anthony nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. But I keep thinking about something my surgeon used to say, don't fight a battle on enemy territory if you can help it." "What does that mean in this context?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. "It means," Anthony explained, "that taking this through official channels puts the power in their hands. The university system is Professor Whitman's home turf. She knows all the rules, all the loopholes. We need to find a different approach." As they talked, Anthony's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a campus-wide announcement about an upcoming event, Faculty Student Forum on Inclusive Excellence in Education. He read it aloud to the group. "Join us for an open conversation about creating inclusive learning environments where all students can thrive." Faculty and students are encouraged to share experiences and suggestions for improvement. A slow smile spread across Anthony's face. "This is it. This is our opportunity." "What are you thinking?" Danny asked, seeing the look in his eyes. "I'm thinking we need to prepare our case carefully, not as a complaint, but as a constructive contribution to making the university better." Anthony pulled out his notebook where he'd been documenting incidents. "We need data, specific examples, and most importantly, realistic suggestions for change." "You want to call her out publicly?" Richard looked nervous. "Not exactly," Anthony said. "I want to address the behavior without making it personal. This isn't about taking Professor Whitman down. It's about making sure what happened to us doesn't keep happening to others. As the group began to plan their approach, Anthony felt a familiar sense of purpose, the same feeling he had leading his unit through difficult missions. This was different terrain, but the principles were the same. Assess the situation, gather intelligence, plan carefully, and execute with precision. He looked around at the small group forming around him, students who had been silenced but were now finding their voices together. He hadn't come to university looking for another battle, but some fights found you whether you wanted them or not. And this one was worth fighting. The day of the Faculty-Student Forum arrived faster than Anthony expected. He spent the previous week meeting with his growing group of allies, fine-tuning their approach. Each person had contributed their documented experiences, creating a troubling pattern that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. The forum was held in one of the largest lecture halls on campus. By the time Anthony arrived, 15 minutes early as always, the room was already half full. Faculty members occupied the front rows, while students filled in behind them. "You ready for this?" Tanya asked, appearing at his side. Anthony took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They found seats in the middle of the room, where they'd be visible but not confrontational. One by one, the other students from their group arrived, spreading out across the room as they planned. Richard Thomas Dunny and several others gave subtle nods as they took their places. At exactly 7 p.m., Dean Harris stepped to the podium. "Welcome to our semester's Faculty-Student Forum on Inclusive Excellence. Tonight's discussion focuses on creating learning environments where all students feel valued and heard." Anthony listened as the dean outlined the format. Faculty would share initiatives first, followed by student perspectives, then open dialogue. He tensed when he spotted Professor Whitman sitting in the second row, her posture rigid. 3 professors spoke about diversity programs and inclusion training. Their words sounded good, but Anthony noticed the gap between these ideals and his own experience. When the microphone opened for student comments, he waited as 2 others spoke first about general concerns. Then it was his turn. Anthony approached the microphone set up in the center aisle, his veteran's pin visible on his jacket lapel. He placed his notebook on the small stand, but didn't open it. He knew what he needed to say. "Good evening. My name is Anthony Rivers. I'm a junior majoring in political science, and I served 15 years in the Army before coming here." His voice was steady, neither angry nor apologetic. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak tonight about something important." He noticed several faculty members sitting up straighter, giving him their full attention. "When I enrolled here, I expected academic challenges. What I didn't expect was to be systematically dismissed, interrupted, and graded unfairly because of who I am." A murmur went through the room. Professor Whitman's face hardened. "I'm not here to point fingers or name names," Anthony continued. "I'm here because this isn't just happening to me. Over the past month, I've connected with 12 other students who've had similar experiences in certain classrooms." He gestured toward his scattered allies, who each raised a hand briefly. "We are veterans, Black and brown students, Muslim students, LGBT students. Different in many ways, but united in one experience. Being treated as if our perspectives have less value, our work deserves harsher judgment, and our voices don't belong in academic discussions." The room was completely silent now. Anthony could see Dean Harris leaning forward, her expression concerned. "We've documented specific instances." He finally opened his notebook, not to read from it, but to hold up as evidence. Patterns of interruption during class discussions. Dismissal of contributions even when they're based directly on assigned readings. Significantly lower grades for work comparable to our classmates. Anthony paused, making brief eye contact with Professor Whitman, whose face had gone pale. "But we're not here just to highlight problems. We're here to suggest solutions." This clearly wasn't what many had expected. Anthony saw surprise on several faculty faces. "First, we propose anonymous grading for all written assignments. Many universities already use this system to prevent unconscious bias." He outlined their other suggestions, recording lectures for review in grade disputes, creating clear rubrics for class participation, and establishing a mentorship program pairing minority and veteran students with supportive faculty. The goal isn't to point blame or create division, Anthony said, his voice growing stronger. The goal is to build a university where the principles of inclusion that we talk about are actually practiced in every classroom, for every student. As he finished, the room remained silent for a moment. Then Dean Harris stood and approached the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Rivers. This is precisely why we hold these forums, to hear genuine concerns and thoughtful solutions." She turned to the audience. Would any faculty like to respond? To everyone's surprise, Professor Whitman stood up and walked to the microphone. Anthony tensed, preparing for denial or counterattack. "I would like to say," she began, her voice tight, "that anonymous grading has been proposed before and rejected due to administrative challenges. However," she added, glancing at Anthony, "perhaps it's time to reconsider that decision." It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was a concession. Small, but significant. As the discussion continued, more students came forward with similar stories. Faculty members began asking questions, some defensive, others genuinely concerned. Dean Harris took extensive notes, occasionally making eye contact with Anthony and nodding. By the time the forum ended, the energy in the room had shifted. What began as a routine event had transformed into something meaningful. As people filed out, several professors approached Anthony, asking to hear more about the experiences he described. "That was incredible," Tanya said, joining him as the crowd thinned. "You were so calm, so professional." Anthony smiled slightly. "In the Army, we learned that how you deliver a message is sometimes as important as the message itself." As they walked toward the exit, Dean Harris stepped into their path. "Mr. Rivers, I'd like to speak with you tomorrow in my office if you're available. This conversation needs to continue." Anthony nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be there." Outside in the cool evening air, Anthony felt lighter than he had in weeks. The battle wasn't over. It had barely begun, but for the first time, he felt like victory was possible. The meeting with Dean Harris lasted over 2 hours. Anthony brought his notebook filled with documented incidents, while the dean listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly taking notes. By the end, she looked troubled. "This is concerning, Mr. Rivers. Very concerning," she said, closing her own notebook. "I want you to know I take these allegations seriously." "Thank you, ma'am." "But what happens next?" Anthony asked. After years in the military, he knew the difference between sympathetic words and actual action. "An investigation, effective immediately," Dean Harris replied firmly. "Professor Whitman will continue teaching, but we'll have peer observers in her classes. And the anonymous grading proposal you mentioned, I'm implementing it as a pilot program this semester." True to her word, changes began the very next week. Anthony noticed a senior professor sitting quietly in the back of Professor Whitman's class. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Professor Whitman's tone was more measured, her calling patterns more balanced, though she rarely made eye contact with Anthony. 3 weeks after the forum, an official email arrived in Anthony's inbox. Professor Whitman would be placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the university's investigation. Students in her classes would be transferred to other professors for the remainder of the semester. Word spread quickly. That afternoon, Anthony's phone buzzed constantly with messages from the others in their group. Is it true? Did we actually make this happen? What do we do now? The last question stuck with Anthony. What came next? He had focused so much on addressing the problem that he hadn't thought much beyond this point. His answer came unexpectedly the following day when Mr. Wilson from Veterans Affairs called him. "Anthony, I want to talk to you about an opportunity. We've been authorized to create a peer support program for veteran students, and after what you did at that forum, I think you'd be perfect to help build it. The program would connect incoming veteran students with more experienced peers who could help them navigate campus life, academic expectations, and the unique challenges of transitioning from military to university. Anthony would receive a small stipend and valuable experience for his resume." By the start of the next semester, Anthony's life had transformed. He balanced classes with his new role in the Veterans Peer Support Program, which quickly expanded to include mentoring for minority veteran students facing challenges similar to those he had encountered. "You've really found your calling," Tanya told him one afternoon as they studied together. Once just classmates, they had become close friends through the events of the past months. I guess I have, Anthony admitted. It wasn't what I planned, but it feels right. The investigation concluded just before spring break. Professor Whitman would return to teaching, but only after completing extensive training on inclusive classroom practices. Additionally, she would be supervised for the next year, with regular evaluations from both peers and students. The day before classes resumed, Anthony received an unexpected email. Professor Whitman was requesting a meeting with him. He considered declining but decided to hear what she had to say. They met in a neutral space, the campus coffee shop, with Mr. Wilson present at Anthony's request. Professor Whitman looked different somehow, less imposing, perhaps more human. She didn't waste time with small talk. Mr. Rivers, I wanted to speak with you directly before returning to teaching, she began. The past few months have been educational for me. Anthony listened silently, noticing how she struggled to maintain eye contact. The investigation found a pattern in my behavior that I hadn't fully recognized in myself. Her voice faltered slightly. I've taught for 27 years and prided myself on maintaining high standards, but I've had to confront evidence that those standards weren't always applied fairly. It wasn't quite an apology, but Anthony recognized how difficult this conversation must be for someone as proud as Professor Whitman. I appreciate you telling me this, he said simply. I'm required to teach a section on inclusive education for new faculty next fall, she continued. And I'd like to invite you to give a guest lecture on the veteran student experience, if you're willing. The irony wasn't lost on Anthony, the professor who had tried to silence him now asking him to speak. Not out of genuine respect, perhaps, but it was still progress. I'll think about it, he said honestly. On the last day of the spring semester, Anthony was invited to speak at a university-wide event about the new initiatives sparked by the forum. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the packed auditorium, faculty, students, administrators all listening attentively to what he had to say. In the middle section, he spotted his group, Tanya, Richard, Thomas, Dani, and the others who had stood with him. In the back row sat several new veteran students he'd been mentoring, and in the faculty section, he noticed Professor Whitman sitting quietly, taking notes. When I returned to school after 15 years in the military, Anthony began, I expected to learn new things. What I didn't expect was to become a teacher myself. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. The lesson I hope we've all learned isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about the power of speaking up, not just for yourself, but for others who might not have the strength to do so. It's about turning negative experiences into positive change. As he continued speaking, Anthony realized that what had started as a personal battle against one prejudiced professor had become something much bigger, a movement toward genuine inclusion, a chance to make the university better for everyone who would walk its halls in the years to come. And that, he thought as he looked across the attentive faces, was a victory worth fighting for.